Well, with this last session on the Protestant Reformation, I want to try to gather up a few threads here at the beginning, do a little bit of review. We've covered a lot of territory, lots of names, lots of topics, and maybe try to gather them together a little bit and give us a minute to think about the significance of what was happening. So there is in the Protestant Reformation tradition a Latin phrase, semper reformanda, always reforming. And that is a value, that is a principle in the Protestant Reformation tradition. Now, the truth is, the Catholic Church also was undergoing Reformation, and we can think about how and in different ways. But it also causes us or prompts us to think about some of the problems. So I could start with monastic movements, different monastic movements within Catholicism as reforming movements. And that could take us centuries back before the Protestant Reformation. But even outside of monastic movements, people like Erasmus and other leaders like him were working to reform the church. And some of that was through this reconnection to the ancient documents, the Greek New Testament resources that they were rediscovering. And anyway, there was a very strong sense within Catholicism that some of their ways of being, their organizational practices, their increasing wealth, their struggles with power, all needed to be reformed. That was going on within the Roman Catholic Church. But there were certain forces and factors that just weren't being properly addressed. And Martin Luther is a good example of one of those areas where the idea of God's justice was really primarily understood as God's wrath, and people were feeling anxious and worried. Now, so before we get to the English Methodism and English Reformation, I would like us to maybe just think out loud together about the need for renewal, perhaps in our own time. And by our time, I don't mean just our specific generation, but longer. And you know, just think, for example, let me throw this out and see what you think about it. Sometimes you perhaps have been in an organization that was really struggling in some way, and you had the sense that the organization needed maybe some reorganization somehow. And you can think of like a church congregation and groups within that congregation that maybe you felt like needed to be reorganized. You know, maybe it's the way the youth group has been running, or the women's group, or something like that. It can be very specific that way. It can be a whole denomination that has organizational issues. Things cost too much, decisions take too long to get made, the processes are boggy. You can think organizationally. You can think lots of different ways like that, but you can also think spiritually, or even use a kind of fancy word here, existentially. You know, that you just get the sense that something isn't right. There's something not right in my life. You know, this kind of conventional way of doing the Christian faith doesn't seem to be working. I don't feel connected to God. I'm not, you know, to use some traditional language, I'm not sure I'm saved. I don't have confidence in my relationship with God, and I'm not sure what to do. So, I mean, we can think of the need for reformation at an individual level, in an organizational level, or just more generally. And, you know, I kind of have that sense about, say, the 60s, for example, when it seemed like after this period of, you know, church prominence as people moved to the suburbs and churches were being built and churches were growing and a lot of people were going to church. And then in the 60s, this kind of wariness about the church and the establishment, the criticism of the church and traditional Christianity started. I kind of think I've lived in a period of time where there's been a lot of soul searching and a lot of criticism and a lot of kind of looking around and trying things out, you know, spiritual, not religious, is the way it came to be known as. I'm just wondering what your sense is about Reformation just generally, and do you see things that are sort of like what we've been studying about in the Protestant Reformation now, or do you think they're really different, or what would be your perspective?
Well, I can think of two things. Well, one in particular, when they were still United Methodists, people like Kevin Watson and Scott Kisker would always hearken back to the Methodist church is on the wrong path. You know, it needs to be much more reading the Bible and being spiritual and this and that, rather than, you know, appealing themselves to the greater society, trying to draw people in that way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'd include myself and myself and those efforts, you know, thinking that way, this attempt to renew the church. Yeah. Yeah. We haven't done such a good job.
Well,
Still working at it.
Still working at it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good. Anybody else? Just, and you know, I mean, the sky's the limit here. You can think more personally, you can think about some organization that you were part of, but I'm just after this sense of, you know, that need, you just feel like something's not quite right and you need to do something.
I think of Christianity in the US in general. I feel like we've lost track of what the gospel actually means.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a lot of different gospels sort of out there.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we need to get back to that.
So what's an example of a gospel out there?
Okay, one is, you know, just ask Jesus into your heart.
Mm.
You know, the gospel is, he died for your sins, ask him into your heart and you'll be saved.
Done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, it's easy to, you know, we read the word gospel all the time, or good news in the Bible, and we rarely stop to say, well, what is the good news they were talking about?
Yeah.
And I feel like what we think is the good news and what they thought was the good news isn't the same thing.
Yeah.
And then I think we also see, you know, the good news is that we can make the world a better place.
Yeah.
You know, if we just solve all the social ailments that we have.
Yeah, if we can fix the conditions.
Yeah. We will, you know, we're going to be saved somehow.
That'll fix everything.
Good news. Yeah. So those are two examples of good news that are kind of out there.
Yeah.
And I feel like we need to get back to when the Bible talks about good news or the gospel, just what did those people mean?
Yeah. What do the apostles mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know, a little bit of thinking like this, I think, helps us see that the phrase, the Reformation Latin phrase, semper always, reformanda, always reforming, is a good principle, right? Now,
Mm-hmm.
you can take that too far where, you know, the old image of, you know, somebody digging up the plant every couple of days or digging up the seed to see if it's growing, right? we can take this thing too far. You know, Reformation, there has to be a certain degree of continuity and stability. But the idea that we need to be sort of collectively self-aware and aware of the need for repentance and change. So semper reformanda is an important principle for us to think about. And then to say also, to recognize that there are times when the situation is critical enough that something has to be done. And I think that's how we understand Luther and his time. And even though it was difficult and in some ways, well, in some ways brutal and, you know, really, I hate to use the word cruel, but that's the word that comes to mind. I mean, people were really at odds with each other over this, and the church hierarchy felt threatened, and the church being in line with the government. You know, when the powers that be feel threatened, then they try to really clamp down on things. But the church eventually does reform. The Council of Trent does some things, but reform goes on. So that principle works for the Roman Catholic Church as well. Perhaps it's not understood in quite the same way as Protestants. But I said all that to say tonight, when we look at the Church of England and what leads to the formation of Methodism, we see again how the need for reform shows up. So, all right, we covered a lot of kind of technical and legal and theological stuff last week with the Church of England's formation. Let me just quickly set some things in place. The forces at work in England from King Henry VIII forward, you've got his need for a male heir and his desire to be free of the Catholic Church while remaining Catholic in his doctrine. You have a son of his. He finally has a male son who's raised really by Protestant Calvinist teachers and leaders. So you have King Edward's time as a switch to more reformed ideas and reformed influences in the Church of England. And then we have Queen Mary back to Catholicism. And then we have Queen Elizabeth, and that's the Elizabethan settlement. She has a long reign, and some things do eventually settle into place for the Church of England. The Church of England is independent of the Roman Catholic Church. It is, in that sense, a Protestant communion or denomination. And they settle on these three items, you might say, as the core of their doctrines and their practices. So the Book of Common Prayer, much of which was written by Thomas Cranmer, who himself leaned Reformed, leaned Calvinist. He also appreciated Luther. So because of Cranmer's influence through the Book of Common Prayer, you're getting more of the Reformed ideas, the more Protestant ideas. The Articles of Religion are more Reformed, more Protestant. The books of homilies, more Reformed and more Protestant. At the same time, you've got all these practices that still look Catholic. They call their pastors priests. The priests wear vestments. They call the communion table an altar. Because remember, these people for centuries have been Catholic. So it's not like just all of a sudden you flip a switch and everybody now thinks like Protestants, the way we think of Protestants, right? So the fact that they still call so-and-so Father so-and-so, and that they still go to worship, and there's still elements of sacrifice associated with Holy Communion. Even though we don't call it the Mass, it doesn't have the same sacrificial meaning, but there's still enough of that sense. And it's called the altar. And it's okay to remember the saints and to use images and icons and things like that, even though it's not, that's now of secondary importance according to the official standards of the church, but it still feels, I'll say it this way, Catholic. So you have, you might say it this way. So in this Anglican middle way, the via media, you have a Reformed head and a Catholic heart. Now, that seems apt. What?
You didn't think of that, did you? Did you? No, I'm teasing. I thought you were about to say you stole it.
I might have thought of that. No, I'm sure I picked it up from 100 different sources. And I don't like the head-heart division like that, but it makes the point that this Anglican middle way was very unsatisfying to a lot of people. So we have the settlement, the Elizabethan settlement, but not that much is actually settled in the minds and hearts of the people. So we got to keep in mind there are still a lot of Catholics living in England, particularly up north. So the kind of the aristocratic, landholders and people like that up north still very much committed to Catholicism. They don't like what's going on. Now, here's the thing. That sets them up to be viewed by others as always potentially in league with Catholic nations like France or Spain. And so working in the background is always this feeling like, oh, what if we go to war with, one of these countries? Are they going to be loyal to England, or will they switch loyalties? That sort of thing is working in people's minds. So there's the Catholic dissatisfaction with this, but more in line with where we're going, there are Protestants within the Church of England who think the Reformation in England has not gone far enough. Doctrinally, we've kind of got the ship going in the right direction, but priestly vestments, calling at the altar, some of these other remaining Catholic characteristics should go. And this goes way deep into details, like how, what does baptism mean, and whether or not the practice of having godparents is a good idea. It may be interesting to you to realize that when a woman had a baby, the mother was usually not at the baptism of that baby because she's still recovering, right? And the baptism happens quickly. And so it's the godparents who are standing in place, so to speak, of the parents. And the reformers who wanted to keep the Reformation going in a more Protestant direction didn't like that, right? That it smacks of Catholicism, it smacks of superstition, and things like that. So there are just loads of examples like that to show there are people thinking we need to take this Reformation further. And today we call them Puritans. Now we have to be careful. You see the word separatists on here. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of doctrine and experience and ideas and philosophies, so to speak, between Puritans and separatists. But the Puritans are more the people who are willing to work within the system. The separatists are, no way, we are not going to abide by the Act of Uniformity. So the Act of Uniformity passed in, I'm forgetting the exact year, I think it was 1559, not long after Queen Elizabeth becomes queen. There are several acts of uniformity, but the Act of Uniformity basically says you must use the Book of Common Prayer, you must agree with the Articles of Religion, and preachers are going to read from the Book of Homilies, right? Like preachers didn't often create their own messages. Some did. If you were kind of higher status, more educated in certain positions, you could, as they called it, take a text and preach. But the average priest on a Sunday morning in, a local village, he's going to read the sermon. And once in a blue moon, he'll preach his own. So the Act of Uniformity says, you got to do these things. You must comply. The separatists are the ones who say, oh, no, we're not. We're not going to do these things. They're not biblical, right? So they tend to leave the country. We tend to think of Bloody Mary as, burning people at the stake and all that. There were people who died under Elizabeth's reign as well for their faith and because they would not comply with the new Church of England standards. So separatists, many of them went to Holland, and they are now again, connecting with people in England. They are the ones who go to America, and we know them as pilgrims, and they basically settle in Massachusetts. So, as far as what we're doing with this session, that's the end of their story. But the Puritans are still in England, and they're still working within the system. They're loyal subjects to the Queen. They have, a good number of them have status. They're members of Parliament, and they're continuing to have these discussions and debates and arguments.
So Steve, this would be before we were the United States of America. We were just colonies then.
Yeah, this is still in the 1600s, basically, is what I'm talking about now. Well, really, I was talking about the 1500s, but leading up to the 1600s, moving into the 1600s, because, the Pilgrims come to Plymouth Bay in 1620, right? So, so as I mentioned, Puritan influence in Parliament, and it grows, and the tensions within the Church of England and the government increase during the 1600s as these parties, you might say, what I'll call the more high church party, the more kind of committed to, the crown and this Church of England way of doing things, under the leadership of Archbishop William Laud. Then there are the Puritans who want to continue pressing for Reformation. And eventually it all comes to a head in the trial and execution of a king, King Charles I. And he's actually found guilty and beheaded. Now, just think about how unthinkable this idea is. We can think about Roman emperors and revolutions and things like that, but during this period of time, there was the prominent view was the king is sort of like an earthly parallel to God. The king acts sort of in the place of our Heavenly Father as like the father of the whole nation. And so for subjects, because everybody else is a subject, right? There's the king, everybody else, even the peers, even the aristocrats are subjects. They have pledged loyalty to the person of the king. And with this influence that was coming from the Puritan side of things, they actually cut off the head of their own king. And at that point, or shortly afterwards, England became, for a brief time, a commonwealth, not a kingdom. And this is the Puritan Commonwealth, as it's known. And the Parliament, the word rump there, it was a much reduced number of people in Parliament, because a lot of these members of Parliament left, right? They got out of town when things got hot enough. And so this rump Parliament passed all these laws, making England a commonwealth.
Hey, Steve, what was King Charles guilty of? What did he do that was found guilty?
Treason.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, it's a really complicated story.
Yeah.
Okay, so the picture on the left that you're looking at is Oliver Cromwell. He was a member of Parliament, and those are his dates there. He was a very astute military leader.
Mm-hmm.
So, with the execution of the king, a civil war in England starts. And the New Model Army, as it was called, under Cromwell's leadership, won the war. And so the Puritans have taken over. The problem is the Puritans did not know how to govern. You couldn't set up a whole new government without a king. There, people are just used to king and the king's privy council and the way the parliament operates. The Puritans were not very good at governing. And so in 1660, the monarchy is restored. And the son of Charles I, so the son of the executed king, becomes king. I mean, it just seems so, I'm not sure what word to use for us modern Americans who've never lived in a kingdom and have no idea what it was like to, to have these kinds of sensibilities about things. But this is fairly common, where monarchs are killing members of their own family to protect their power.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would patch up, make things up, make up, and form alliances and just carry on virtually like nothing had happened. So
sounds like today.
Well,
Political world.
Right. Yeah. Some of the same kinds of acts of vengeance and recrimination and all that. Yeah, that's true. Okay, so the monarchy is restored in 1660.
So when the English talk about the Civil War, is that the Civil War they're talking about?
Yes, yeah. And there are actually, specifically, there are two wars, but it's basically known as right? And it's this one. Now, this is all background to where I'm trying to get us to with Methodism. So in the Restoration, a new act of uniformity, again, with strict adherence to the Book of Common Prayer, etc., etc. And what happens here, and this affects the Wesley family quite directly, what happens is that you have all these clergy who are, we would call them evangelicals almost, Puritans. They would rather be called pastor rather than father. They are in some ways very much like what we would think of as an independent community church. They are nonconformists. They will not use the Book of Common Prayer. They will not wear priestly vestments. They will not do those things. They dissent from the Church of England. And in 1662, those who refused to comply were kicked out of their parishes. It's known as the Great Ejection. But that didn't last. In 1689, people are getting kind of tired of the conflicts, the disagreements, the instability, social instability, you might say. So the Act of Toleration in 1689 was passed. Now, keep in mind, this is the Parliament. This is a law, the Act of Toleration, giving nonconformists and dissenters, like Baptists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, in other words, Puritans, they could have their own churches, their own organizations. They don't have to use the Book of Common Prayer. They don't have to agree to the Articles of Religion. They can be their own denominations, for lack of a better term. Now, who is not included? Take a guess. Who?
The Catholics.
Catholics are not included. Jews are not included. So they're not recognized. They don't get to abide by their own. Atheists are not included. So if you're a a vocal atheist, you could get yourself in trouble and wind up in jail. But you see this, you see a step in the direction of what we think of as kind of modern live and let live, think and let think sort of responses. So we kind of settle in the Church of England to these two parties within the church. The high church, they're the more traditional, they're in that line of priestly vestments and ceremony and, really unthinking loyalty to the king, uncritical loyalty to the king. And king and church are very much connected, in this Christian state. The latitudinarians, the high church and latitudinarians, they're all Anglican. They're all in the Church of England. But the latitudinarians are the more so-called moderate Anglicans. They are starting to see there are some beliefs that are absolutely crucial to the Christian faith, but some of these things can be left up to the individual. Let's give people some latitude, right? So this idea, this is an attitude, a disposition that's really beginning to take hold among leaders in the churches and in Parliament. And so you still have this kind of tension, this disagreeing going on. And so the question really arises, what is necessary for authentic Christian faith? It's good for us to ask that question, right? What would you say is absolutely necessary to be authentically Christian?
Salvation by faith.
Spoken like a good Protestant.
Exactly. Yeah, what did he say? I missed it.
Salvation by faith.
Salvation.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, good start. What else?
For Jesus.
Demonstrated by good works, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, so true
Faith
saving faith. Go ahead.
Say it again, Linda. We missed you.
Yeah.
Faith demonstrated. So
Yeah.
not the declaration of faith, but that you show that you have faith. You live
Right.
your life in a way that demonstrates faith.
Right. So faith logically necessarily works out in loving behavior for others. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? What else do you think is necessary?
Well, I
Now,
think
this isn't getting into heaven.
Yeah.
It's not that question. It's what does the true Christian faith look like in reality now? So what we've said so far, anything else you'd want to add?
worship with other Christians, continue to grow.
Okay.
No, it's going along with all the customs that are changing.
Yeah. Could you say more about that, Sandy? Now it's going along with the customs that are changing? Yeah.
It's more the social gospel to me and social justice than it is true faith in Jesus.
So some things have been added from another direction that now to be a real Christian, you need to get on board with. Yeah. Okay. Well, I just think it's a good question to ask. That's really what the Protestant Reformation has been about all along, sorting out how do we recognize true, authentic Christianity, in touch with Jesus, in touch with the apostles, and whatever else we think is essential to that. Now, again, because we're talking about a period of time when church and state really are intertwined, we have to think also politically. In this mix of people are non-jurors. Okay, so again, we can't go into detail here, but who is on the throne? Right? You have
No.
So
Elizabeth.
you have until James II, you have a steward on the throne. And then with William and Mary, the dynastic family changes. Now there's a remote family connection, but we're moving now to a different house, right? And so some people don't believe the new king started with William and Mary. They're the legitimate king, and in that case, queen. They're not legitimate. This actually created difficulty between Samuel Wesley and his wife Susanna, right? So non-jurors are the ones who say we don't recognize this king as a legitimate monarch. And the Jacobites are a group of people. They were never big, they were never very powerful, but the Jacobites were convinced that the Stuart, right, they're in exile in France, is a descendant of the Stuart line, right? And they believe, the Jacobites believe, that he should be on the throne of England. But of course he's not, because now we've moved to the House of Hanover. And anyway, so these folks are in the mix here too, and there's a little bit of anxiety about, well, what if the Jacobites really get in charge? And in 1745, there was an attempt to get this Stuart king, Bonnie Prince Charlie, as he was called, Stuart Prince, to take the throne of England. And there was a relatively mild attempt at invasion of England. It didn't really work. Long story short, yeah. Question?
So the I guess I have a hard time, and you said that this getting my mind around the idea that who is on the throne as the king or queen, or kings and queens, is part of the religious conflict.
Oh, absolutely. It's all together. Because here's the thing. Spain is Catholic, France is Catholic. If the wrong, if the Catholics in England make alliances with these Catholics, that's the religious part, right? Then England could be invaded. Spain tried it back in the 1500s. And so there's always this fear that something like that could happen. And so religion and politics are very much mixed together. And there was a time that John Wesley was thought by some to be a Jacobite. He wasn't, but he was thought to be a Jacobite. So it influences some of Wesley's life as well.
And would you remind us when Wesley's years, because Wesley's alive during this time?
Well, we're getting there. He was born in 1703, so this is all just background.
Okay.
But the bottom point there is what I need to put in front of you now. So just imagine, generally speaking, weariness with the conflict. We fought a civil war. These religious debates have become interminable, and they seem to be not as important. Certainly not important enough for people to die. And so, there's a certain kind of mindset coming into prominence, but there's still this fear of a Catholic takeover, right? So it remains unsettled. Now, okay, we paused the English stuff because I'm trying to set up these influences for Wesleyan Methodism. We go back to Germany, closer to the time of the Reformation in Germany. In 1618, a war in Germany breaks out between the Catholics and the Protestants, and it lasts for 30 years. And it is horrifically destructive. 1618 to 1648. And because that war was so bloody, the need for people to be very clear about which side they were on takes hold. So in the German Protestant churches, the Lutheran churches, a specific idea regarding orthodoxy comes into play. And here's the key point about that. Having faith, experiencing faith, meant to agree with Protestant doctrines. It's a little bit like showing your party allegiance. So think of it that way. Party allegiance begins to supersede true living faith. Faith becomes thought of as agreement with this set of doctrines. Can you hear what I'm getting at?
Mm-hmm.
All right. By the end of the 30 Years' War, Central Europe is just devastated, absolutely devastated. And the Lutheran Church is trying to kind of put the pieces back together. But you have this issue with, orthodoxy. The Orthodox party in the Lutheran Church is the party in charge. So at the lay level, at the local level, there's a fair amount of dissatisfaction with life in the church, with the Christian life. And this Lutheran pastor named Philip Spener, along with others, begins to advocate for renewal. Philip Spener, there are his dates. He writes what was supposed to be an introduction for another book. It turned out it was long enough, it became its own book. Pia Desideria, they all used Latin in those days, so that means pious wishes, right? Or reverent desires. And Pia Desideria was a vision for renewing the church, and it was based in reclaiming the truth about faith as a living thing, a personal connection to Jesus Christ that is experienced. And you are aware of, you have faith in Christ, and you have this very personal sense about connection to God through Christ. They wanted to go back to just reading the Bible, right? Instead of having these doctrinal fights, let's just get together in small groups, which they did. They're called Collegia Pietatis. These are small groups in Germany. Let's just get together and read and pray and seek God and try to discern how God might be leading us to carry on our lives now. So more informal, more relational, in this sense, less doctrinal or doctrinaire, and more practical. Spener, for example, preached many sermons on the new birth. For example, from John 3, new birth by the Spirit. So this spiritual, personal, lively connection to Jesus Christ, that was, what they're doing is they're actually reappropriating what Luther had experienced, what Luther had taught. And this movement that becomes known as Pietism starts to spread. And there's a group of them that become known as Moravians because they settle in a certain part of, it's kind of Eastern Germany or it's Western Poland, kind of moves back and forth. But the Moravians become, they send missionaries to the American colonies, and that's where the Wesleys first meet the Moravians, but we'll get to that. Okay, so Pietism is helping to spawn what we would call revival or renewal. Now we go back to England, and we're getting to the Wesleys now. John Wesley and Charles Wesley, the Wesley family, their grandfather, both grandfathers were dissenters. They were, in that sense, they were Puritan, right? They were simple faith, Bible-based, very simple worship, just all the things that we have in our minds associated with Puritanism would be true of both John Wesley and Samuel Annesley. And Joni's looking at the T in the name here. That's actually the way it was spelled. For some reason, the T got dropped out at some point, and it just became the Wesley that we know. But So John Wesley's paternal grandfather, John Wesley, and Samuel Annesley were both ejected from their parishes in 1662.
From their Lutheran parishes.
No, they're.
Church of England. We're back in England, right? Sorry. Thank you for asking that question. Yeah, we're back in England. And the great ejection in 1662, they were booted from their parishes. John Wesley, the grandfather, he did time in prison. They put him in jail. And Samuel Annesley carried on with a dissenting congregation eventually under the Act of Toleration, and had a very, very significant ministry. So Samuel Annesley, Susanna, John's mother, was a very influential pastor in England during his day. So the Wesleys had this Puritan influence in their lives, right? But their parents, Samuel and Susanna, both raised in these kind of dissenting type family environments, they both became loyal Anglicans with the Book of Common Prayer and everything that goes with it. So the Wesley children, namely John and Charles, grew up in an environment in which a kind of Anglican piety shaped by Puritan inputs really took hold. So they were very regular in their daily prayers. And, Charles and John are both deeply Anglican in all the senses that we would get from the Articles of Religion, the Book of Common Prayer, and the homilies, right? Now, here's the problem for John and Charles, but I'll just focus for the moment on John. In his growing up and his going away to the university and all that, this was also from, listening to sermons, and it was kind of in the environment in the Church of England. Faith equals rational agreement. If I agree with the Articles of Religion, if I understand God as Trinity and I agree with that, and Christ's death on the cross is what saves us, and I agree with that, then that's what makes me a Christian. So if I believe the right things and I do the right things, that's what makes me a true Christian. But when John and Charles meet the Moravians, particularly Peter Böhler back in London, and I'm leaving out gobs of the story.
Yeah.
When they meet the Moravians, they bump into this idea that faith is actually a living, vital, personal, experienced connection to Jesus Christ. And at first, John doesn't believe it. But eventually, after several conversations with Peter Böhler, he's convinced they're right. This is true. And Wesley says, I don't have that kind of faith. I'm not really a Christian. And he confesses this to Peter Böhler. And so, now Wesley is having a kind of spiritual crisis where he's trying to sort out this new understanding of the Christian faith that he himself hasn't really experienced, even though by this time he's been an Anglican priest for 13 years.
And a preacher's kid.
Yep, that's right. And the famous line, which I'll just share the little bit here, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for my salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had forgiven my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. Now, it's easy to pick out that heart strangely warmed. That's just a cool phrase, and it kind of gets at the experience. But notice what Wesley says here. I felt, and he doesn't mean just emotion feeling. He has this sense that he now does personally trust in Christ alone for my salvation. And an assurance, this new confidence was given. He's receiving it, right? It's coming from somewhere. An assurance was given me that he had forgiven my sins, even mine. So all the gospel all the gospel. Now Wesley senses and feels, not in a, this would not have been a super, not your typical sawdust trail kind of emotional conversion experience. This is, Wesley's kind of a quiet guy, so there's not a lot of outward demonstration, but he feels his heart warmed, and he is aware that he now trusts Christ personally in a way that he did not. And Charles had a similar experience a week earlier. Now, here's the thing about the Wesleys. They're not changing their basic theology. They already had a very orthodox theology. What they do have now is an actual experience personally with the living God. And that really changes the way they see things and the way it changes the trajectory of their lives.
Hey, Steve,
Yeah.
I just need to comment that I believe this is the first time I've ever heard that Charles had had a similar experience a week earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seems like the emphasis is always, on John, but
Yeah.
when I heard that, it made me wonder, okay, is there something else going on that John's saying, hey, Charles, that's not a bad idea. Maybe I should get me one of those.
You're such a
Yeah.
cynic.
Well, Jim, he did. The truth is, it did create some anxiety in John, that he'd been sort of seeking this experience for a while, and for lack of a better way of saying it, it just wasn't happening, it just wasn't happening. And so, but he was honest enough, he wasn't going to fake it, but yeah, what you're talking about maybe in a stronger terms. John did feel that a little bit of that anxiety.
Did Susanna? I thought their mother was very devout, and seen just by her prayer life, at least what we know of it, had a really personal relationship.
Well, this is so interesting, right? And who knows? I mean, this is where it gets. She was very devout and had a huge impact on her children. She was in some ways their informing theologian, right? She was the one who taught them things. But it wasn't until not long before she died that she bore witness to a similar kind of experience that we're talking about now. So she began to see that something was missing, that she, there was an aspect to her devotion that wasn't completed yet somehow. And these are the kinds of things that scholars have been chasing down for decades, trying to figure out, and we argue with each other and all that. But my point that I think is important for the study that we've been doing is that bottom one. What Wesley is experiencing now is not unlike what Luther experienced when he experienced the truth of this new understanding, right? So to go back to Wesley, he actually becomes convinced theologically in March of 1738, but he doesn't really have the experience of sort of personally appropriating it until May of 1738. So a little bit more than 2 months later. So you can imagine during that 2-month period, he's really wrestling these things over in his mind. Now, Luther's experience was in some ways much more pronounced and dramatic because Luther was just a different, he had a different sort of personality. But the theology, the doctrine, and the experience, there are similarities between Luther and Wesley on this point. And that does raise the question about, again, true Christian faith. And I believe that they're onto something here. Now, again, people's experience, some people are really quiet and very rational and kind of step by step and have to work it all out. And they can have an experience of true saving faith that looks different from the person who's very emotional and very outward. And, and for some people, it's slow and incremental, little step at a time, but they're cumulatively, there's a change, there's a conversion, there is this personal appropriation of the gospel. Sometimes it's like that, and sometimes it's absolutely in a moment, and it's in that sense miraculous, and and everything in between. But the point here is that this Reformation emphasis on salvation by faith alone, even though works follow, right? But the justification, to be more specific, by faith alone, on the basis of God's grace alone. We're not doing anything to earn it or, convince God that we need to be loved because now we think and act the right way. None of that. It's all God. And this is as true of the Wesleys, as it was true of Luther and the other reformers up to that point.
Steve?
Yeah.
So isn't that the same? I mean, I know Abraham wasn't, in the time of Christ or after the time of Christ, but isn't what they're saying the same thing as Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness?
Yeah, I think we understand it's generally the same thing based on
believe God, what
right.
God is saying about himself and doing.
Right.
So,
so that's the trusting such that you follow like Abraham did. This is the active part, the behaving part, right? You do what God says to do. Yeah. So these questions, and we're really out of time, so I'll just leave them as kind of questions for thinking. I think it's worth, like today, I was working on the sermon for Sunday and thinking about, I'm preaching from Psalm 51 and thinking about some things that, that I'm looking at in that Psalm, and I'm thinking about David's experience and all that. I'm just maybe thinking about some of the limits of my own experience, and so that question, how would you describe the personal feeling associated with faith in Christ, right? And I always want to give the widest latitude that's appropriate here, because we look at kind of the dramatic conversion experience as the only way of experiencing faith, and that's just not true.
Right.
But there's still this there's something personal about it where I know I am connected to Jesus Christ. I have the sense about my sinfulness, and he has forgiven me. And, we can use different ways of saying it, but that kind of personal connection, I think, is really crucial, that the Protestant Reformation helps to clarify. And then the question about the final authority, these renewal movements, there's always this tendency to go back to Scripture, right? We're going to go back to the source, and we use other sources, and the councils are helpful, but no, ultimately, even though we know people disagree about how the best to read the Bible and interpret the Bible, but we just can't get away from the Bible. It's always going to be our North Star. That's a very important part of the Protestant Reformation and movement. And then the last question, which is, was it necessary? Did it need to happen? And, you think about it, in God's great providence, did it need to happen? Or was it just a historical accident, so to speak? Yeah, we would be, or most likely.
And in trouble all the time.
Okay, so we're finished with this. We're gonna go back to the Bible, and we're gonna look at prophets and prophecy and some prophetic scriptures, all kind of getting us prepared for Christmas by looking at some of the Advent prophecies and how they speak about the coming of the King, the Messiah, and all that. So we'll start that. Now, there's some question about next week. Okay. I mean, we can get started next week. We basically have 5 weeks before we stop for the Thanksgiving Christmas break. We'll take a few weeks off during that period of time. So we can, if we start with the prophecy stuff next week, we have five sessions together. If we wait a week, we have 4. What is your preference?
I can do next week.
And Billy and Larry are really, I mean, you guys are.
You're deep
guys
into
are-
Arkalala, so
Yeah,
So
don't
they're-
worry about us. Just go
Yeah.
ahead with whatever you want to do.
okay. Well, let's just go ahead. We'll start with some prophecy stuff next week, and we'll carry on because we'll have a pretty good long break, like 5 or 6 weeks, isn't it?
Yeah, basically the Thanksgiving week through the first week of January.
January, right? So yeah. All right, friends. We'll see you next week.
Okay.
Bye,
good
everybody.
Bye.
Bye bye.
You